there are many people around the world who believe that colonization and slavery were purely about racial segregation and unfair discrimination. And they believe so to such an extent that even those equally gross human rights violations are then decentered or not considered at all. And even here in South Africa, when you think about the advanced colonial regime of apartheid, there are many people who think that it was about whiteness and systemic racism to the exclusion of all other forms of human rights violations. And that is not true, not necessarily true at all. In fact, one of the biggest issues that we've had in our society through colonization is something called white heteropatriarchy. And white heteropatriarchy is essentially an ideology and a system and set of beliefs that if you are white, if you are able-bodied, if you are heteronormative, hyper-masculine, of a mature age, of a particular socioeconomic class, you are then superior to all other human beings. And what this ideology and set of beliefs does is that it creates arbitrary privileges that ultimately harm other people who don't necessarily fall in line with that categorization. And interestingly enough, the farther you are away or the less tags and labels that you have in line with white heteropatriarchy, the more susceptible you are to violence, the more susceptible you are to abuse, humiliation, indignification, and sometimes even murder. And so when you think of white heteropatriarchy and what it's done in our society, it's created multitudinous layers of oppression that have been implanted in our education systems, in our legal systems, in our economy, and in every single aspect of our society, including, our cultural, communities and belief system. A lot of people actually don't realize that some of even the traditional and cultural practices that we perform or that we believe stem from or are influenced by white heteropatriarchy as it was implanted by colonization. But that's a conversation we'll have another time. What I really wanted to focus on today is about some of the manifestations of white heteropatriarchy, particularly in the South African context. However, you will note in this discussion that much of what I'm going to share finds some kind of resemblance in many colonial societies or societies that have survived colonization around the world. So it's not the type of conversation that is exclusive to South Africans. Pretty much any community around the world that has survived colonization can be able to relate to many of the elements of this discussion. So one of the biggest manifestations of white heteropatriarchy is something called gender-based violence. And deliberately, I'm not going to say gender-based violence and femicide because that is a conversation for another day. I want to talk about the umbrella term of gender-based violence, also commonly abbreviated as GBV in our society. So gender-based violence essentially is the unfair discrimination and the creation of arbitrary, biases and harmful privileges based solely on the premise of one's sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And just by that definition alone, one comes to the realization of the fact that anyone can be a perpetrator of gender-based violence, and anyone can be a victim or a survivor of gender-based violence. It is something that is ideologically based. It's a belief system. It's a false one. It's based on a falsehood or a misconception, misunderstanding, deliberately so. It's very intentional. It is not by accident. It is perfectly engineered, and that's why it is so pervasive and has lasted so long in our society. What I want you to understand about something like gender-based violence is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Just like white heteropatriarchy, when someone experiences an incident of gender-based violence, the person privileges themselves over and above everyone else, but there's also a decline in the dignitas of other people or another person in that process. So it's not a linear process or a process or something that happens within a vacuum. There's like an an experience where someone's existence or their value as a human being is raised or put on a pedestal above someone else, but someone else also exists under the thumb of another human being or society itself. So you're basically elevating one while pressing down and subjugating another. And that's how gender-based violence operates in our society. There are many forms of gender-based violence. Another misconception about gender-based violence is the fact that it's about me physically hitting someone else. And if I don't do that, then I haven't done anything at all. And that's just not true. There's so many different forms of gender-based violence that are not physical. So for instance, look at how the economy is structured. You can tell without looking very deeply, just superficially, from what we see every day, that the economy is structured in a very specific way where women don't have access to the economy. But because of colonization taking place in Africa and being intertwined with racism, you see that it's not only women, for instance, who don't have access to the economy, it's very specific types of women. It's women of color, and even there's a hierarchy of how people experience that type of a violence. So black women, black African women are right at the bottom of the barrel, whilst white men in South Africa are right at the top of the power ladder in our society. So that's just one of the examples. It's about how much people are paid at work, the opportunities that people get, access to private capital to be able to start your own businesses. Black women have got the least access in South Africa to be able to start their own businesses, and yet they constitute the biggest demographic in our society. It is not by accident that those things have happened, and they have incredible linkages to apartheid and colonization before that. Now, just going back to gender-based violence in our society and why I've linked it to colonization and apartheid is because if you look at the aggravators of gender-based violence, the use of drugs and alcohol, unemployment, close proximities of homes within communities and poverty, etc. When you look at those aggravating factors of gender-based violence and femicide in our society, it's very easy to link our experiences as black people and as people of color during apartheid and colonization. There's a reason why there are so many alcoholic outlets, specifically in the townships. There's a reason why townships are built the way that they have been built, outside of the city center, away from white homes, thereby dismembering black families that had come from, the rural lands to come and get work in the cities. And that, again, is a discussion that we'll have at a later segment about what colonization actually did in our society and how much of what we see on our day-to-day is the manifestation of what was engineered by the leaders of apartheid and colonization before 1994. But if you look at the aggravators of gender-based violence and you look at how our society was engineered specifically for people of color and in particular for black people, you see that those things are intertwined and they feed into one another. And so you have to be able to link our colonial history with how gender-based violence manifests itself and the ways in which the violence manifests in our society. But I also just want to go back to this idea of everyone being a perpetrator and everyone being a victim. That obviously means that even boys and men can be victims of gender-based violence in our society. And, one of the ways in which this manifests, and this is incredibly important, is with regards to the grooming of young men, for example, in school settings where young men are forced to perform initiation-related activities, even if it means their death. We've had a number of cases where boys have been assaulted, even sexually so, and have no place to speak out about the horrors that they've endured within these initiation camps because boys don't cry. And the system itself, the justice system, the service providers within the justice system don't take seriously the experiences of violence and trauma experienced by boys. And the same can be experienced by men as well. Yes, to a less extent, but it does actually happen. And it's something that we ought to take very seriously. Gender-based violence can also manifest in psychological and verbal abuse. And one aspect of that I actually would like to talk about is in relation to tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So I have to say that one of the areas that have been poorly regulated over the years is the online world. The online world is really just a community that is online as much as in real life and has always needed to be regulated. But unfortunately, it hasn't. And what that has manifested in is pervasive violence against women and children in particular, in the form of revenge pornography, the use of misogynistic and absolutely gross, demeaning and indignifying languages online, and conversations online. And some of this also manifests itself in the media, the multimedia that we consume. So these are some of the blind spots. I think a lot of people believe that because something is online, it doesn't matter, but it is real. People do business online, they socialize online, they learn online. And so it is a community, just like in IRL, that has to be protected from the manifestations of gender-based violence and patriarchal ideology at large. So that's it from me on that. There is so much more to unpack. What does multitudinous mean? What is oppression? What is subjugation and subordination? There's so much language and words that have come just from these couple of minutes. And if you continue on this journey with me, I promise to unpack those with you. Take care.